Okay, we have one storytelling to end the day, and that is Steve. Steve, can you hear me? Yeah, Steve is going to tell. Steve is going to tell a personal experience story, and it's called sauerkraut. Is that correct? One of my favorite foods, sauerkraut on a hot dog. So, Steve, please introduce yourself. Tell us about your work. Please tell us a story. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I am on mute. Okay. Will I be spotlighted or?
I'm spotlighting you for the recording, but everyone else is
Okay.
spotlighting you if they wish.
Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm Steve Daut, and I live in Michigan, in a little town by Ann Arbor, Michigan. And, in Michigan, we do this, so I would be right there. Uh, I tell a lot of different types of stories. I appreciate the folk tales and fairy tales, and I have some that I have modified for my own that you might not recognize at all because of the way I've rewritten them. And I also tell some Mark Twain stories and have studied his life and stories a bit. And part of that's because I actually grew up on the Mississippi River, so when I was a child, I heard many Mark Twain stories, and I've been telling those for the last 4 or 5 years, but also personal narratives and so forth. Uh, most of my personal narratives are almost true, and so this is one of them, and it uh, well, it should speak for itself. We call it sauerkraut. When I was in third grade, my parents had moved. When I was 7, they got divorced, and we moved to this new town. So in third grade, as soon as I started going to class, I realized that there were a number of things that they taught in these schools that they had not taught in the school where I came from. And so I had a lot of remedial work to do. And the teacher seemed to sort of resent me for that because she also had to help me along that way. And when she did, she just was kind of mean to me. And one day I was sitting there in class and I had to go to the bathroom. And I raised my hand, but she seemed not to acknowledge me or see me. And so I started getting a little frantic and I started bouncing up and down and I was moving my hands around and and I thought for sure she would see me, but at one point she looked right at me and she shook her head no. And then she went back to teaching the class. And at that point, I sort of gave up and I let go. And I peed my pants. And I thought, it's maybe 10 minutes before the end of class. So maybe I could put my head down on the desk and the other kids will maybe think that I have gone to sleep and they won't say anything. But unfortunately, the girl on the desk next to me had seen it and raised her hand, and the teacher acknowledged her right away. And she said, Steve Doubt peed his pants. And the teacher looked at me and said, well, I guess you better go home then. And so I stood up, my 7-year-old self stood up, humiliated in front of the class, and I dripped all the way home. And that night, I made myself sick, worrying about all the horrible things the kids were going to say to me the next day and how terrible it was going to be. And the next morning, I told my mom that I was in too much pain. I was too sick to go to work, to school. And she said, well, I have to go to work. And she pushed me out the door and she locked me out on the porch. And I laid there screaming bloody murder. Oh, I too much pain to go to school. And eventually she came out and she took me next door to Grandma and Grandpa's house, said, you deal with this kid. I have to go to work. Well, Grandma started lecturing me. And Grandpa stepped in and said, no, I'll take care of this. Now, my grandpa was an old German guy with an easy smile and a little wink in his eye, a twinkle in his eye, and he would show me things. And he would, when he showed me these things, he would wink at me, and then he'd say, "Siehst du?" And I always thought he had a pet name for me. I thought he was calling me Stu, but it turns out "siehst du" in German means "do you see?" So I had the right language, wrong language, but the right message. And he said, let's go downstairs. He took me downstairs that day and he said, we're going to make sauerkraut. Well, the way Grandpa made sauerkraut, he had this kraut cutter. It was about 3 feet long. It was a big piece of wood with these diagonal blades in the bottom of it and 2 rails that went across. And there was an open wooden box that would sit on these rails and slide back and forth. And we put the cabbage in that open box, slide it back and forth across those blades, and it would slice the cabbage into fine ribbons. And he had a 5-gallon crock. I still have it down in the basement. And we would put some cabbage in there and then some salt. And cabbage, salt, layer that all the way to the top. And then we had a kraut stomper, what he called it. It's like a butter churn, and you pound that cabbage down and just compress it and bruise it until with the salt it would give up its water. And then you take a level about maybe an inch thick of cheesecloth and some rocks, and you put that on top so that the cabbage was submerged under this briny, salty cabbage water. That was step number 1. Step number 2 is you leave it set. After about a week, it would smell, the whole basement would smell like something had died in there. And that's when it started working. And then you left it for another 2 or 3 weeks until it smelled like whatever had died had resurrected and died again. And at that point, you knew it was done. And so you'd go down put on a gas mask and go down there and strip off the rocks and the cheesecloth, and there would be a layer of cabbage about that thick, this green, rotten, nasty smelling cabbage, and scoop that off the top and get rid of that. And underneath was the most incredible tasting sauerkraut you can ever imagine. Well, we had done step number 1 that day. It took us all day long. And standing there on that concrete floor in the basement. And so we were done. We went upstairs. And Grandpa was leaning on his crutch harder than I'd ever seen him. He always wore a crutch. I never thought much of it. But this day he was leaning so hard I thought the crutch was going to just break. Well, it didn't. It held. And Grandpa went into the living room and sat in his easy chair, asked me to go and get his kit from the bathroom. And when I did, I came out and he had rolled up his pant leg and his shin bone was bent right in the middle of the shin bone, and his foot was kind of twisted in. I'd never seen this before. And right there where that bone was bent, the skin was bright red and stretched so tight I thought it would split wide open. Well, he rubbed some liniment on it, and he took a handful of aspirin from that kit and swallowed those aspirin. And I asked him what had happened. He said, well, when he was about my age, when he was 8, he had broken that leg, and his parents were new immigrants to the US from Germany, and they didn't really speak the language very well, and they didn't have a network of friends yet, so they didn't know how to access the medical system. And so they set that leg the best they could. But over the next couple of years, he broke that leg 7 more times. And I realized that from the time he was my age, he had moments of just excruciating pain. Well, after the aspirin kicked in, he told me this poem. Said, when I was young and had no sense, I bumped my head against the fence. The fence was rough and I was tough, and you bet your life I'd had enough. And then he winked at me. He said, "Cease to," and he went to sleep. And I thought about it. I thought, you know, with that pain that he carried with him all the time, it must have been when he was my age going to school that he couldn't go out and play with the kids, and the kids probably teased him for his funny bent leg. And he had that pain all of his life. Every day of his life, he had moments of excruciating pain, but he never let it define who he was. Well, I can't say that I have had a perfect life since then. I have times when I think, I don't want to do that, or it feels like it'll be a little too threatening or too painful for me. But when I have those thoughts, I think about Grandpa and its sauerkraut, and I go ahead and do it anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. So
Nice to have a letter.
sauerkraut, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, nice to have hear how your grandfather made sauerkraut, because I've attempted it too. And yeah, I'll try rocks next time.
You got to keep it down under the water so you get anaerobic.
So
Yeah,
I'm
the
trying-
imagery of
Yeah.
that stuff when you came downstairs and the smell of death and death again, right? Like it was just, all I thought was, and you said it was the best, and the way, the way you described it, I could see it was the best, but the imagery that you created for me, I could not imagine putting it in my mouth. I just couldn't, so, but I'll never look at the sauerkraut that my husband eats. I don't eat the stuffs, but the sauerkraut that my husband eats, I'll just say, you just don't know what you're missing, because there's a totally other way of making it.
Well, I'm
Thank
thinking,
you.
go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was going to say I have a couple of times talked to my wife about making sauerkraut, and she's like, "No, no, I know what it smells like."
Well, Steve, I'm thinking about how sauerkraut is a, what it means in this story, how it relates to the pain your grandfather was feeling, and the transformational process that the cabbage goes through. Can you say anything about that? Well, I mean, why is this story called sauerkraut? How does that relate to everything else?
Well, it's one of those stories where I put the metaphor right up front.
Mhm.
And sauerkraut is absolutely the metaphor for how we deal with things in life, and that is that there's that layer of nasty rotten stuff at the top, and sometimes you have to get through that to get to the sweetness underneath. And so I just it's a true story, and I just found it as a beautiful metaphor for exactly what happens when you you are able to overcome things in your life by looking a little deeper into what's going on.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's that. I've have a history in theater as well, and so I do think about that. You know, sometimes you want that metaphor to be kind of hidden, but but there are times when I think it's useful to bring it right up front and let people kind of stew over that and be a little more direct about it.
Mhm. Rupa,
Yeah, Steve, I like the way you started with your childhood experience and you wove it in. It was so wonderful, and we've all had experiences with like mean teachers. So you were there with us, and it was very well done, and it really tugged at my heartstrings. Your story. Thank you.
Thank you.
sometimes we have to play injured. I mean, even if we're have some pain, we have to carry on.
Yeah, well, and again, that's the thought of it. My grandpa was just he really became a surrogate father for me because you know and I tell a number of stories about my actual father and so forth, but I frankly, Grandpa, and I have a little longer version of that. Frankly, Grandpa probably saved my life because I was a bit of an angry young man after all my experiences there, and Grandpa was always had that ready smile and always had that wink and was just a, a crazy guy, and in fact I have gotten my sense of humor from him. He used to do things like at Thanksgiving dinner, I asked him to pass the cookie plate, and of course he dumped the cookies on the table and handed me the plate, and things like that he would do, and so that always struck me that because he always found some silliness and time to make a joke or tell me a silly story. So he was a big influence for me.
Okay, thank you very much. Radhika?
Thank you all.
Hi, Steve. I'm Radhika from Sri Lanka. I really love the way you made the story, I mean, so light, starting with your child self and, the school experience, and then how you dragged us into the story of your grandfather. It was really cute and light, and I felt that you really captured my heart in terms of actually relating to your grandfather's energy, which is really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. I do find I actually do a workshop about adding humor to stories or using humor in stories, and especially in serious stories, because I feel like it makes it more accessible. You can hear it better if if I can demonstrate that I have enough perspective on this story, especially if it's very personal. That if I can inject a little humor, then it makes it easier for you to open up to the story a bit. So I do feel that's an important element of it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.